Hello everyone and welcome to today's Sutta class. We will start as usual with the Namo Tassa. Feel free to join if you like. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So, hello everyone and welcome to today's Sutta class. If you hear any noises in the background, we have some plumbers here working right next door to my room. So hopefully that won't disturb us too much. So for today's session, I thought it would be nice to talk a little bit about Vinaya. That means about the monastic rules. And I know that it's not that interesting for most lay people, but I think it's also a good idea to just have a general understanding about what Vinaya is about and like the general setup of what the rules are and why Vinaya is important. And actually, I actually gave another talk a few days ago for a group of practitioners, for a friend of mine who is also a nun. And when I talked to them about Vinaya, it really turned into this really lovely discussion and people had a lot of questions and it was really interesting. So I thought it would be a good idea to also talk about Vinaya here a little bit. Because I know most of you are also very experienced practitioners. And so just having a general understanding about what Vinaya is maybe a good idea, even though most of you who are listening are probably not monastics. So that's what we're going to do today. And as you know, the Vinaya is a very important part of the monastic scriptures, of our Tipitaka, of our Pali canon, or generally all Buddhist canons, whether that's in Pali or in the other languages, Chinese, Tibetan, and so on. So if we look at the Buddhist canon, it's always divided into three parts. The Sutta Pitaka, that means the discourses or teachings of the Buddha, and then the Abhidhamma and the Vinaya. So Vinaya has a very, very important role, and it's kind of equally important to the suttas and to the Abhidhamma. So when we talk about Vinaya or when we talk about monastic rules, a lot of people have kind of a negative first reaction when they hear, oh no, there's so many rules, or when they hear the word discipline, it sounds really terrifying and it sounds really off-putting to many people, because obviously people practice the Dhamma to attain freedom from defilements, freedom from samsara, and freedom, from the things that constrain us. So putting more constraints on us and limiting our choices more seems kind of counterintuitive, and it seems kind of off-putting to many people. So a lot of people don't really want to hear about those rules and don't want to follow kind of those rules. So the first thing that I want to talk about is why it's quite important to have those rules and why those rules are actually helpful and they're not actually hindering us, or they're not actually constraining us, they're actually supporting our practice. And I think many of you probably have been to monasteries before, or you have been to Dhamma centers before, or you have been to retreat centers before. And probably when you have been to monasteries or when you have gone on retreat, you have experienced that there would be a few rules in those monasteries or in those centers. For example, some monasteries, when you go there as a layperson, they will ask you to wear white clothes. Or when you go to a retreat center, they will ask you to maintain silence while you're on the retreat. Or in almost every place, there is a schedule that tells you how to divide your day, that tells you what time to get up, what time to meditate, what time you have breakfast, what time you have lunch, what time there's a work period, and so on and so on. So everything is quite structured. And obviously, that's not Vinaya, but that's already that's already some rules that are in place. And for somebody who just wants to do whatever they like, that can be quite off-putting, and then people might not want to go back to such places. But for people who actually go there to practice, for people who actually go there to be on retreat or to experience the monastic lifestyle in a monastery, if you really comply with the rules and if you really try it out and spend some time there, then you will see that this is actually very, very supportive for your practice. For example, if you maintain silence, if there's a rule to be silent and you maintain silence, then obviously that means you don't have to interact with other people. People don't constantly talk to you. You don't constantly get drawn outside, and especially your hearing obviously doesn't constantly get input. And so your mind doesn't constantly get busy. And you really have the opportunity to just come back to yourself, just focus on yourself and just, experience your own mind, your own mental states, and everything that's going on inside of yourself. And obviously that's really, really conducive to meditation practice. And that's really helpful for understanding how the mind works and for developing wisdom. So you can see it can feel a little bit constraining in the first place to follow all these rules, but actually it's really, really helpful for practice. So if there's a schedule, for example, then it's also really helpful. Obviously, you can't do what you like whenever you like, but it's really helpful because you don't have to make all these decisions. You just know, I get up at that time, I meditate at that time, then there's breakfast for everybody. And it's really helpful both for your own, both to unburden your own mind, but also to maintain harmony in the group. Because obviously, if there are people there who don't follow the schedule and don't follow the rules, then that will impact on everybody in the whole community. So if one person starts talking to each other, to the others, then that's not only a problem for the practice of that one person, but it actually disturbs everybody else. Or if one person doesn't follow the schedule and disrupts everything, then obviously that's kind of annoying to everybody else. So by just having those rules in place, everything gets really simple, and the harmony in the group is preserved much more easily. There's much less reason for starting to have a conflict, much less reason for arguing, much less debate about what we should be doing now and how we should be doing things. It's just there is a system in place and everybody follows it. And then it's just really easy to kind of live together. So that's for very similar reasons, the Buddha also put the Vinaya in place to just foster harmony in the Sangha and to make it really easy to practice. And so the first text that I want to read with you today is the Buddha explaining why he lays down Vinaya rules. And actually, the Buddha didn't just randomly lay down Vinaya rules whenever he liked, but actually it was always, there was an incident, somebody misbehaved, a member of the Sangha misbehaved, people started talking about it, and then the Buddha heard about it, and then he called the Sangha together and investigated the incident. And if it turned out to be true, then he would give a teaching, and he would explain to all the monastics why that was inappropriate, and he would give 10 reasons why now he was going to lay down a Vinaya rule. And so that's what I want to read with you today first, just to understand the Buddha's way of thinking when he put those rules in place. And so the first text we are reading is in the live chat now. This is from the first rule in the Vinaya, and obviously the first rule is not abbreviated, and so for that reason, this whole passage is in there. In all the other rules, we should understand that it's also in there, but it is abbreviated, so we can't really find it. But here in this rule that I have given you the link to, that's what the Buddha says. And so the link takes you to a passage in the middle of the text, which is when the original incident had already happened. Somebody had really misbehaved. The Buddha heard about it, and he has gathered the Sangha. And now at this point, the Buddha says the following. Then the Buddha spoke in many ways in dispraise of being difficult to support and maintain, in dispraise of great desires, discontentment, socializing, and laziness. But he spoke in many ways in praise of being easy to support and maintain, of fewness of wishes, contentment, self-effacement, ascetic practices, serenity, reduction in things, and being energetic. After giving a teaching on what is right and proper, he addressed the monks, or he addressed the mendicants. So the same is obviously also true for the nuns. Well then, monastics, I will lay down a training rule for the following 10 reasons. For the well-being of the Sangha, for the comfort of the Sangha, for the restraint of bad people, for the ease of good monastics, for the restraint of corruptions relating to the present life, for the restraint of corruptions relating to future lives, to give rise to confidence in those without it, to increase the confidence of those who have it, for the longevity of the true teaching, and for supporting the training. And monastics, this training rule should be recited like this. And then at this point, the Buddha lays down the rule, whichever rule it is. So here, first of all, the Buddha speaks about the general mindset that you should have as a monastic, like some general principles that should apply to you in whatever situation you're in. So not only when you are close to breaking a Vinaya rule, but generally these are principles that should guide your life, your entire life, if you are a monastic. So the Buddha says you should be easy to support, you should be easy to maintain, because obviously you depend on the lay people for your survival and you don't want to make it difficult for them. You want to make it as easy as possible so that everything goes smoothly and so that they don't feel overburdened. Obviously, in the same vein, you shouldn't have great desires, you shouldn't be discontent, you shouldn't be lazy, you shouldn't be fond of socializing because that just kind of stirs up the mind and just distracts you from practice. But obviously, you should be exactly the opposite. You should have few wishes, you should be content, you should practice self-effacement, you should practice serenity, of course, reduction in things, so don't cling to all these material things. Of course, there's a baseline of what you need in terms of material things because you have a material body and that needs to be maintained. But generally, we would try to train ourselves to turn our mind away from all these material things and turn it inward so that we can focus on our practice, learn how our mind works, attain higher stages in meditation, and so on and so on. So these are just some general principles that always apply. And let's say if there is a rule and you interpret the rule in a way that goes against those principles, for example, it makes you very difficult to support and it's really burdening the lay people, then you need to ask yourselves, are you really using this rule in the correct way? Is there maybe another interpretation that would make more sense? So these are general principles that all the rules have to fall under. And if they do the opposite, then you're probably applying the rule wrong. And so then after the Buddha has taught what is right and proper, he gives 10 reasons why he lays down Vinaya rules. And the first one is for the well-being of the Sangha. And I've already talked about this a little bit. It's really important when you live together in a community that there are certain rules in place so that it doesn't turn into complete chaos. Because if everybody does whatever they like, it's just very annoying for all the others and everything is totally unstructured and everything is very chaotic and nobody really can focus on their practice because they're just trying to somehow organize their life. So for the well-being of the Sangha, there need to be certain structures and rules in place. And then for the comfort of the Sangha, so that second point is very similar to the first one. But of course, again, the rules are not there to punish people, but they're actually there to make us very comfortable. Because it makes life very easy. Everybody knows how to organize things. Everybody knows how to do things. Everybody follows the same standard. There is not much conflict. Or there can be obviously conflict for other reasons, but at least for these general how to organize the monastery and how to organize the life, that should be fairly free from conflict because there is just a standard that everybody should adhere to. So that makes people very relaxed, very comfortable. Then the third point, for the restraint of bad people and for the ease of the good monastics. So obviously in a perfect world, everybody in the Sangha would be like-minded, everybody just wants to practice, everybody has a pure heart, but we all live in samsara, we all live in the real world, so we know that people, even if they have good intentions, are still full of defilements, not to mention that there can be people who actually have bad intentions. And there can be people who really enjoy putting others down, or who really enjoy making life difficult for others. But if there is a Vinaya in place, and if there is a structure in place and those rules are in place, then that severely limits the kind of harm that those people with bad intentions can do to others, as long as they keep the Vinaya. So for the restraint of people with bad intentions, those rules kind of keep a barrier around what they can do, the kind of harm that they can do. And again, for the ease of the good people. So of course, the good people will enjoy having all these protections because it's just really conducive for their practice. And then the next 2 points are for the restraint of corruptions relating to the present life, and for the restraint of corruptions relating to future lives. So as long as we are not arahants, we all have corruptions, or we all have defilements in our mind. But if we have the Vinaya rules in place, that really limits the kind of bad karma that we can make. Because not all of the Vinaya rules, but quite a few of the Vinaya rules have an ethical component. They relate to virtuous behavior or to wholesome behavior. So if we keep those rules, then we're not going to make bad karma, at least not too much bad karma. Because we're not going to do stuff that is really, really harmful, because the rules are preventing us from doing that. And so we're not creating much suffering for this present life, and we are not creating much suffering or bad karma for the future lives, and we are not feeding into our defilements too much. And then the next 2 points: to give rise to confidence in those without it, and to increase the confidence of those who have it. So this relates to the way that the Sangha is kind of interacting with society. So as Sangha, obviously, we're not just hiding away in the monastery all the time. We have contact with the wider society, and we're supposed to be an inspiration for other people to practice Dhamma, and we're supposed to be kind of role models for others. And so if we follow the Vinaya rules, then that means we look inspiring and presentable, and we try to be inspiring. Obviously, if there are no Vinaya rules and people just give rise to all the defilements all the time, and they fight with each other, and there's conflict in the Sangha, and everything is in disorder, and the monastery looks like a huge garbage dump, then obviously that wouldn't be inspiring. But if we follow the Vinaya, then everything is nice and orderly and clean, and people kind of hopefully have harmonious relationships with each other. And then obviously people can see that the Dhamma works, and that the practice kind of helps us to maintain harmony and to kind of get rid of our defilements. And so for people who don't have confidence in the Dhamma yet, if they see well-practicing monastics, then that should increase their confidence and maybe bring them to the Dhamma, and maybe kind of give them a motivation to start practicing. And for people who already have confidence in the Dhamma, that will inspire them more and give them more motivation to practice. So monastics also have a responsibility how they interact with the wider society. And then the next point, for the longevity of the true teaching. And the last point, for supporting the training. So for the longevity of the true teaching, so to make the Dhamma persist in the world, not to let it fade away, or not to let it get lost, get forgotten, it's very important to have a Sangha that is strong and that is well practicing. Because the Sangha really is the guardian of the teaching, and they are responsible for practicing properly and for transmitting the teaching to the next generation. So if the Sangha is just busy fighting and doing whatever they like, then obviously nobody practices properly, so nobody actually realizes the deeper stages on the path, and nobody actually has the time to preserve the Dhamma and to pass it on to the next generation. But if the Sangha is practicing properly, then obviously that will protect the Dhamma and make sure that it gets passed on down the line in a fairly clean and pure state, without having any alterations. And then lastly, for supporting the training. So this training that we're talking about here is obviously the gradual training or the training in the Noble Eightfold Path. So the whole training of letting go of defilements and attaining awakening. And so as we have already seen, those rules are really, really very supportive, because they create a lifestyle that really makes it possible to focus as much as possible on this internal development. So those are the 10 reasons why the Buddha has laid down Vinaya rules. And so, as I mentioned, before he lays down any rule, he always explains those 10 reasons. So, and now I just wanted to give a brief overview about how the Vinaya is structured and how what kind of different categories of rules there are in the Vinaya. So when we have a look at the Vinaya Pitaka in the Buddhist canon, or especially in the Theravada canon now, in the Theravada scriptures, in the Pali canon, the Vinaya Pitaka has 5 books. And in the first 2 of those 5 books, we have what is called the Patimokkha's. So the Patimokkha's are the monastic codes. These are lists of rules, the main rules, the most important rules for the monks and for the nuns. And because they're different for monks and for nuns, we have 2 Patimokkha's. And in the Patimokkha for the monks, we have 227 rules in the Pali tradition, and we have 311 for the nuns, again, in the Pali tradition. But in those first 2 books of the Vinaya, we don't just have lists of rules, like the Patimokkha's, but we have each and every one of those rules embedded in, let's say, some kind of commentary. So with a lot of explanations to each and every single rule. So every single rule will start with an origin story, which explains kind of exactly what happened, what kind of incident, how did somebody misbehave. So it gives us a context why the rule was laid down. Because sometimes there's a rule and we don't really quite understand what they're getting at. So if we have the context, then obviously we can understand much better why that rule is there. And then sometimes there are some modifications to the rule because people were unclear about something, or because some more happened, some more misbehavior happened later, so the rule got modified. And then there is the final ruling by the Buddha. And what comes after that is a word definition. So every important word in that rule will be defined so that everybody is fully clear what the rule means. After that, we have case studies. So sometimes, obviously, the rule covers one case, but then there can be situations that are really very similar, but they don't quite fully fulfill the exact parameters of that rule. So there are case studies for things that are very similar and how to act in those kind of situations. And then finally, there are exceptions to the rule, because obviously not every rule can apply in every situation. There should be some boundaries where the rule applies and sometimes where it doesn't apply. For example, many rules don't apply if somebody is sick, because then obviously you need to be more relaxed and you have the opportunity to do whatever is necessary for your illness. So these are the first 2 books of the Vinaya Pitaka, the Patimokkha's, with all their explanations. Then the next 2 books are called the Mahavagga and the Chulavagga, or both books together are often called the Kandakas. And these are 2 books that have a lot of additional rules, probably thousands of more rules that monastics are also supposed to keep. But those rules are considered a little bit more minor than the ones we have in the Patimokkha's or the monastic code. But we don't only have rules in those books, but we also have all the monastic ceremonies. So for example, obviously the most important ceremony are the ordination ceremonies for the monks and for the nuns. We also have all the other ceremonies for the Vassa, for example, so the rains retreat, for Katina, that means the robe offering at the end of the Vassa, and for many other ceremonies that come up regularly in monastic life. But also we have chapters on every important aspect of monastic life: how to make robes, how to build monastic buildings. One chapter about medicine, a chapter about how to resolve conflicts, how to make decisions in the Sangha, and so on and so on. There's a huge amount of information about all the various aspects of monastic life, all in those books. And of course, there are many stories from the Buddha's time about things that happened in the Sangha back then. And then the last book of the Vinaya Pitaka is called the Parivara. This is kind of like a summary of the rules. This is a book that originated much, much later than the other books. So those are the 5 books of the Vinaya Pitaka. And for the rest of today's talk, I want to focus on the Patimokkha's or the monastic codes, because these are really the main rules. These are the rules that we recite on the Uposatha days, so on the moon days, the full moon, and the dark moon days. And generally, these are considered the most important rules. And not all of the rules in the Patimokkha's are equally important. As I mentioned, there are a few hundred rules in both of the Patimokkha's. And some of them are more important and some of them are obviously less severe rules. So the most, so the monks' Patimokkha has 8 categories of rules and the nuns' Patimokkha has 7. But both of them have the most important category of rules, and these are called the Parajikas. And Parajika rules are very, very severe rules. That means if you break one of those, then immediately you're no longer a monk or you're no longer a nun. And also you cannot ordain again in the future. So under normal circumstances, if for some reason you decide you no longer want to become a monk, you no longer want to be a monk or a nun, you can just disrobe. And if at a later point in your life you change your mind, you just can get ordination again. But if you break one of those rules, then really that's it for you. And you cannot ordain again in this life. And even if you continue wearing this robe and refusing to take it off, you are not a monk or a nun anymore. And the other monastics are not allowed to treat you as though you were a monk or a nun. So you just fraudulently wear this robe without actually being a monk or a nun. And there are only a handful of rules in this category. One, for example, is killing a human being. Obviously, if you do this, it's super unwholesome. You cannot be a monk or a nun anymore. Or having sexual intercourse, that would also immediately end your status as a monk or a nun. Stealing something of great value, things like that. So that's the first category where you're immediately excluded from the Sangha. Then there is a category below, which is called the Sangatisesas. These are also very severe rules, but they are remediable. It's very complicated. It's a very, very complex procedure. It's very annoying. It's very embarrassing for you to go through that, but it's also very annoying for the Sangha at large to have to organize this kind of procedure. So these are also rules that you really, really should try not to break. It's a very severe kind of category. Below that, for the monks, there is a category called the Aniyatas. The nuns don't have this category, only the monks. And this category is very small, only has 2 rules. And these 2 rules state that if there is a woman that claims that a monk has either sexually molested her or harassed her or raped her maybe even, then the Sangha has to carry out an investigation. And they're not allowed to just sweep this under the rug and ignore it. They have to carry out an investigation and look into these allegations and then act accordingly. So you have to take action then. And depending on what the investigation finds out, you have to treat the monk accordingly. So if he's innocent, then of course nothing happens. But if he has, let's say, if he has raped somebody, then obviously he had sexual intercourse, he needs to be excluded. If there was something that was a bit less severe, then he needs to be treated according to the category of rule that he has broken. So it's not allowed for the Sangha to just ignore this. And then below that are various categories of more minor rules. Those are called the Nisaggiyas, the Pachityas, the Patidasaniyas, and the Sikyas. All of these are fairly minor rules, but there are hundreds of those rules. And then the last category are not really rules. They are just kind of guidelines how to deal with conflicts in the Sangha and how to make decisions and in the Sangha. So this is how the Patimokkha is structured, and these are the main rules that we have for monastics. But what is really very interesting, we've already seen this in the beginning, that the Dhamma and the Vinaya are very closely intertwined. So by keeping Vinaya, we are supporting the Dhamma and we are supporting our own practice. But also when we look at the Dhammas, when we look at the discourses of the Buddha, there is a lot of Vinaya in the discourses themselves. So, of course, most of you are very familiar with the Sutta Pitaka, with all the discourses, the suttas from the Buddha. And many of you have therefore come across a lot of Vinaya already. So, for example, when you look at the gradual training, there's always a section. The first section is always about sila, so virtuous conduct. And depending on which version of the gradual training you read, there can be long lists of monastic rules there. For example, if you want to have a look in Majjhima Nikaya 27, the Chulahatipadupama Sutta, this is one version of the gradual training where you have a long list of various monastic rules in the section about sila. So even in the suttas, we have a lot of Vinaya mixed in. And even in the Vinaya, we have a lot of sutta teachings mixed in. So these are not two separate things. They're very, very closely intertwined. And we again see how Vinaya supports Dhamma and how Dhamma practice supports Vinaya. And there are some other examples. For example, in Digha Nikaya, number 2, the Samanyapala Sutta, there are long sections on morality. Actually, there's a short section, a middle section, and a long section on morality. And that also contains a lot of Vinaya rules, but it also contains a lot of extra regulations for monastics that we don't necessarily find in the Vinaya in that amount of detail, but obviously that monastics are also supposed to keep. So we find guidance on how to behave as monastics, not only in the Vinaya Pitaka, but actually all over the suttas as well. And I don't know if you remember, a while ago, we together on this channel read the Samagama Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. And there we had a very close look at various monastic procedures for conflict resolution that are actually taken from the Vinaya, but that are explained in the Sutta. So again, we see how all of this is really very closely intertwined. And so for at this point, I think it would be nice to have a look at one of the Vinaya rules in a little bit more detail so that we can see how they are structured. And the one that I have picked for this is the rule about offering food to monastics. So I think many of you who have had interactions with monastics before, who have been to monasteries before, you will know that usually before the meal, the food gets offered to monastics. And monastics will generally not eat the food unless it has been properly offered. So because most lay people are familiar with this rule, I thought it would be nice to have a closer look at this one. And so let me post the link in the live chat for that one. Let's see. So it should be there now. We are using Ajahn Brahmali's new Vinaya translation. So this is a Pachitya rule. A Pachitya rule is a fairly minor rule. If you break this rule, obviously you should never purposely break a rule. But if you break this rule, then it's not too difficult to clear this. You just have to own up that you broke the rule. You just have to inform somebody, tell somebody what you did. If you don't try to hide it, if you just confess it openly, then there is no further consequence. So it's very easy to clear. You just need to tell somebody. And generally, with the more minor rules, this is the way to clear this kind of offense. And so this is Pachitya number 40 for the monks, or number 122 for the nuns. So this is a shared rule. Both monks and nuns have this rule. And so as I have mentioned in the beginning, every rule starts with an origin story. So a story that tells us why this rule is there and what exactly happened. So let's just read through the origin story for now and then talk about it a little bit. At one time, the Buddha was staying in the hall with the pig roof in the great wood near Vesali. At that time, a monk who only used discarded things was staying in a charnel ground. He disliked receiving things from people. Instead, he would take whatever was offered to the dead on the charnel ground, at the foot of trees, or at the threshold, and he would use that. People complained and criticized him. How can this monk take the offerings to our ancestors and use them? This monk is big and strong. One might even suspect him of eating human flesh. And then the monks hear about this, and then they tell the Buddha, and then the Buddha calls the Sangha together, and he investigates whether this is true. And after he has established that it is in fact true, he goes through what I read out in the beginning, those general principles for monastics and the 10 reasons for laying down a rule. And then he lays down the rule. If a monk eats food that has not been given, he commits an offense entailing confession. So an offense entailing confession means a Pachitya rule. So here, this is quite an interesting origin story. There is a monk, and actually that monk is trying to be a really, really good monk. He's trying to follow all these general principles that the Buddha has given, to be really easy to support, to let go of material possessions, to really practice contentment. And for that reason, he doesn't even accept any kind of offering from the lay people, but he just uses things that are already put on the charnel ground. And of course, this monk thinks, well, the dead people are not going to eat this kind of food, or they're not going to use these requisites because they're already dead. So he kind of just takes them and he eats that, or he uses that. But then lay people are still attached to these things because they thought it was offering for their ancestors, so they don't want other people to use it. And so the lay people complain and they criticize him, but they don't just complain and criticize him for taking the stuff, but we can see how quickly things get out of hand. When people have defilements and when they are upset, then things start to spiral and rumors start to develop, and suddenly he is being accused of being a cannibal and he's being accused of eating human flesh. So things kind of got out of hand very quickly. And so the Buddha hears about this, and then the Buddha rebukes him. And so what we are seeing here, that even if you're a good monk, these kind of things can happen. Even if you kind of were trying to do the right thing, even you were trying to be easy to support, these kind of things can happen because he didn't take into account how this would kind of would be seen by the lay people. And in the beginning, we talked about the 10 reasons why the Buddha laid down Vinaya rules, and he said one or two of the reasons actually is to inspire people. So we have to always think about how our behavior will be perceived by the general public. And so here, obviously, it was not inspiring. People got very upset. And obviously, this was a practice that was too ascetic. So the Buddhist path is the middle way, obviously not being too indulgent, but also not being too hardcore. And here, this monk was too hardcore. And so for that reason, the Buddha laid down the rule. And then when the Buddha laid down this rule that food needs to be offered, obviously, if the food is offered, then it is really clear this is food that you can eat, and whatever hasn't been offered is food that you cannot eat. So by offering, it just makes a very clear distinction and makes it very clear to the monastic that the lay people are willing to give up these material possessions, that they're willing to hand this over, and that this is designated for the Sangha to use. And so you won't be accused of stealing, you won't be accused of taking stuff that other people wanted to have. It just makes it very clear, and the monastic can have peace of mind when they use this. And then, as I mentioned, the rule is adapted later on because people were unsure if you can drink water that isn't offered, if you can clean your teeth with tools that aren't offered. So back then they used tooth sticks or tooth cleaning sticks that were made from wood. And obviously nowadays we use toothbrushes, but all of this is okay, doesn't need to be offered. Then there's a final ruling, then there are definitions, all the words are defined. What is a monk? what means that something is given or not given, what is food, and so on and so on. Every word in the rule is defined. And then there are the case studies, here called permutations. So what happens if you are unsure if something has been offered or not, or what happens if you thought something was offered but it was actually not offered, and so on and so on. And then finally, there are the exceptions to the rule. So if somebody is insane, if somebody is sick, and so on, various exceptions to this rule. And so this kind of gives us an idea why this rule is there, to avoid the monastics being accused of taking stuff that wasn't meant for them, of stealing maybe or something, and also to have harmonious relationships with the lay people, because obviously monastics are dependent on the lay people. And this rule obviously also is very closely linked to some other of the food rules that you might be familiar with. One of the famous ones that I think most people know is that monastics cannot eat after solar noon. Usually that's 12 o'clock. In daylight savings time, that might be 1 o'clock. So that's a very famous rule. Lay people also often keep this on Uposatha days, or people on 8 precepts might keep this for their whole life. There is another rule that monastics are not allowed to store food overnight. So you can't just come to the monastery, offer all the food one time, and then say, well, that's it for the next week. I'll come back in 7 days or something. You have to actually offer every single day, because monastics are not allowed to store food overnight and things like this. And again, when we have a look at the suttas, then we have a lot of incidents in the suttas, especially in the Majjhima Nikaya, where the monastics are actually discussing those food rules. So again, we see how the suttas and the Vinaya are very closely intertwined. For example, when the Buddha laid down the rule that you shouldn't eat after noon, that caused a big stir in the Sangha, and there were quite a few monks who were not willing to train in this way. And there are, for that reason, a lot of suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya that discuss this. For example, the Kitagiri Sutta, where monks openly refuse to follow this rule, or the Badali Sutta, that's also a very interesting sutta, where the monk Badali refused to keep this rule, and how the Buddha dealt with this and how the situation was resolved. Very, very interesting. But again, we see how suttas and Vinaya just really are two sides of the same coin and support each other. And then before we come to an end for today, I just wanted to make one final point, and that is this rule about having food offered is actually a very interesting rule to see. A general principle in the Vinaya, and that means that those rules kind of need to be interpreted a little bit. And there is some wiggle room in almost all of the Vinaya rules. And that means that different communities or different monastics can apply these rules in slightly different ways. So in this case, you can't eat food that has not been given. So you need to have food offered. But how exactly the food is offered can be done slightly differently in different communities. And so for people who are not very experienced, they often think that there's only one way to do this. And then they cling to their own interpretation, and they start criticizing each other and looking down on each other if there are monastics who are doing things differently. For example, with the offering, food can be offered, for example, by touching the container, let's say the bowl or the pot that the food is in, and you lift it up and hand it over to the monastic. That's one way of doing things. Another way is to just simply offer the entire table in one go, so not each pot individually. Another version is for the lay people to put the food into the bowl of the monastic. So the monastics don't serve themselves, but the lay people actually spoon it in. Another version that is sometimes practiced is, for example, to offer by leaving a note on the table. Let's say the lay person has cooked in the morning, but then they had to go off to work. So by the time the monastic wants to eat, they are not there to actually offer. So then sometimes it can happen that they just leave a note, everything on the table is offered. Or they might send a text message saying everything on the table is offered. Or they would just tell you everything in the kitchen is offered. So just take whatever you like. Or sometimes they will tell the monastic, well, I will put the food on the table and just everything that you find on the table will be offered for you. So there are a lot of different ways of doing this. And obviously, a community needs to have a common standard for their community, but different communities or single monastics that are traveling by themselves kind of need to find their own standard. And as you can see, the rule is open for interpretation and everybody can do things slightly differently while still keeping the rule. And so when people are inexperienced, they start fighting over these small things and they start using Vinaya to criticize each other, to look down on each other, to tell each other that they're doing things wrong. And obviously, if that happens, then you're using Vinaya for the wrong purpose. So the Buddha was very clear, this is there to make life easy. This is for the comfort of the Sangha. This is for making things harmonious. And this is for making the group stronger and for making the group more cohesive and more happy and more peaceful. But if you now use this rule to actually start conflicts and to put others down and to criticize others, then obviously you might be keeping the letter of the rule, but you're not keeping the spirit of the rule. And if you're using Vinaya to harm other people or to start conflict, then you haven't understood very, very basic principles of Vinaya. So it's very important when people study Vinaya or when people talk about Vinaya to keep very open-minded, to keep very open-hearted, and to just let other people keep the Vinaya the way they see fit. Unless obviously this is a major thing, let's say somebody actually had sex, or let's say somebody actually has killed a human being or something like in that category, then obviously there is no wiggle room. But for those small rules, it's really important to understand that Vinaya is there for the harmony of the community and for supporting practice, and it's not there to fight with each other. And if we don't understand why somebody does something that way, then we can always politely ask, Venerable, how are you keeping this rule? Or why are you doing it this way? And if you ask politely, then usually people are more than happy to explain why they're doing things one way. But obviously, if we criticize each other, then it's just going to lead to conflict. And then that is not at all what Vinaya is about. So that is very important to keep in mind. At this point, I think I'm going to finish my talk for today, and I will see if there's any question. If you have any kind of question about Vinaya, then please put them in the live chat, and I will see if I can answer it. So far, I'm not seeing any question. Just seeing a few people checking in. Very good, nice to see you. There is one Venerable here also, Bante Viligama Sarana Jyoti. Very good to see you, Venerable. Welcome to the talk. So Jim has a question. What about what the law would consider as manslaughter? So this class of rule that I talked about is called the parajikas. So the rules that lead to immediate removal from the Sangha, where the rule about killing falls under. These rules are extremely, extremely complex. And the case studies for these rules are very, very detailed, with probably hundreds of different cases. So it depends very much on the specific details of what happened. Generally, if you did not have intention to kill and it was an accident, then it doesn't fall under this rule. But again, I wouldn't want to make a very blanket statement here. I would really want to see the specifics of each and every case. Generally, if you don't have the intention to kill and it's an accident, then that would not be a parajika. And then one person says, why are there more rules for bhikkhunis? One of the reasons I think why there are more rules for bhikkhunis is that the Vinaya is very male-centric. So the Vinaya was collected and preserved mostly by the male Sangha. And the Vinaya presents stuff very much from a male point of view. And so what seems to have happened is that a lot of, like most of the Vinaya rules, apply to both monks and nuns. But then, because it's a very male-centric rule, very male-centric view, obviously not all of this is very suitable for people with a female body. And people with a female body experience a lot of different situations that the people with a male body did not experience. And so they needed specific rules for the kind of situations that they found themselves in. And so for that reason, there were rules added to the Bhikkhuni side that the monk side didn't need. And I think that's one of the main reasons why there are more rules for Bhikkhunis. Another reason is that sometimes there is one rule for the monks, and for unclear reasons is that it was broken into several rules on the Bhikkhuni side. So basically it's exactly the same rule, but on the monks, like in the monks' Patimokkha, it's one rule, and in the nuns' Patimokkha, it's become 8 rules, for example. So I think that's another reason, rules just breaking up into several parts, stuff like that. And then there's Richard, and he says, thanks for this insightful talk, Ayya. I'm glad it was helpful. Will you be doing more talks on the Vinaya? It's quite helpful. I'm at the moment not really planning to do more talks on the Vinaya. I can. Nothing really stopping me. I'm just not sure how interesting it would be for lay people to go into all the details about Vinaya. It can be quite specific, and even most monastics might find it a little bit boring. So I'm not sure if I will be doing more talks on the Vinaya. Is there any kind of specific topic that you would be interested in? Maybe you can just leave it in the chat, and then probably I'll be happy to do a talk about that. Okay, somebody is leaving messages in Spanish there, so I'm assuming it's Spanish, so I'm not quite sure what they're posting. Okay, that seems to be the last question for today. Let's see if Richard still wants to post something in the live chat about what kind of specific topics would be interesting. Otherwise, we can finish here for today. Hopefully, you liked this somewhat unusual Sutta study today. And we will finish, as usual, with 3 sadhus. Feel free to join if you like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So I wish you a good rest of the day and a good week, and I will see you all next Tuesday. Bye-bye.